So, as mentioned, I'm a PhD student at the Erasmus University, Rotterdam. Today, I'm going to talk about my empirical analysis of the relationship between globalization and sustainable development. Why is it not going? So, what are the potential impact does globalization have on development? On the positive side, we have international trade have increased worldwide productivity and reduced poverty. Political and social globalization have reduced conflicts between countries, both at individual and state levels. And global supply chains also raise the cost of having wars. On the negative side, the gain from international trade is not always equally distributed. So inequalities seem to be rising. And also the establishment of many trade agreements undermines environmental regulation in many developing countries. And besides, culture reserve activists also argue that globalization is intruding the cultural heritage in many ways. So the relationship between globalization and development has been of interest of research for a long time, which results in a vast number of studies on this relationship capturing different aspects. However, the conclusion on the effects of globalization on development is still undefined, and in some cases where different globalization and development indicators are used, results are even contradicted within the same study. And another problem is that not much has been done about the sustainable dimension of the correlation between globalization and development. So, for example, in human development, globalization helps reduce poverty through international trade and global supply chain. However, together with the globalization, inequality also rising because the gains from trade is not always equally distributed among countries and within countries. On the economic development, study on the effects of globalization on economic development also end up in dispute. So you can see in this table, there are summaries of empirical results from studies covering a wide range of country and time periods. And we can find here there are positive effects and also mixed effects, which means that there are positive and negative effects at the same time. Globalization's effect on environmental sustainability is even more complicated than that on economic development. As in this table, you can see we find mixed effects. This is increasing effects, reducing effect, and also effects in the short run and in the long run. So the undefined and even conflict results motivate me to investigate the relationship between globalization and sustainable development from a multidimensional approach. And in order to do so, first I need to define what globalization and sustainable development are referring in my study. So globalization, I believe, to happen when there are cross-society interactions. Such interactions are because of the differences between societies. And according to Weber's theory, there are three main dimensions of a society. That's social, political, and economic dimensions. Hence, globalization should also be considered in these three dimensions. For development, I believe that development should be defined in a way that captures not only the growth itself, but also the ability to grow in long term. So in this paper, development is defined as sustainable development. And this is according to the 1987 Brundtland report, that it is to meet today's needs without compromising future's needs. So next, I need to have a way to measure these concepts in order to have an empirical analysis. So given the importance of studying the consequence of globalization, there have been many attempts to measure globalization, and among the indicators, the curve index has been the most often used when investigating the consequence of globalization in empirical study. In this study, I used the 2019 version of the curve index. For sustainable development, we learned from previous study that the way we measure development could also affect the results. In this study, sustainable development is multidimensional. So this is measured by a new index which captures the human development and ecological dimension of sustainable development beside the economic development. And that is the Sustainable Development Index by HICO 2020. So when I have the data, I always look at what the data tell me in the first slide. So here we have this scatter plot between globalization and sustainable development. And we can see from the scatter plots, there seems to be a quadratic relationship between the two. I also plot the globalization, no, sustainable development against income per capita, and also found a quadratic trend. So this suggests that there might be a Kuhn's curve. So to investigate the relationship between globalization and sustainable development with the given data, I think a Banner regression is suitable. And from the literature, we know that the direction of globalization's effect on development might be affected by countries' institutions. So I included in the model control of corruption and government effectiveness. Also, from my previous study of the Asian UNCEN economic thoughts on international trade, I know that there might be religious effect in the relationship between globalization and sustainable development. So I also included religions in the model. Furthermore, these studies move one step further to capture the dynamic behavior of globalization and development. So I also run the panel VAR analysis. So for the sake of time, I will just briefly discuss the empirical result here. From the panel regressions first, the results suggest a nonlinear correlation between globalization and sustainable development. I also run the same model for dimensional globalization, and this nonlinear correlation can be also found in economic and social globalization, but not in political globalization. From the panel VAR regression, I can perform the Granger causality test, and the results suggest there is a positive causality running one way from globalization to sustainable development. Besides globalization and sustainable development, I also took the chance to once again look at the Kuhn's curve hypothesis. So the results, as in this table, suggest there is indeed an inverted U-shaped relationship between income and sustainable development. So there might be a Kuhn's curve and even an environmental Kuhn's curve. So in sum, my study finds a nonlinear relationship between globalization and sustainable development. And from the empirical result, I would argue that in terms of sustainability, there might be an optimal level of globalization where development could benefit the current generation the most without threatening the future generations. So if you have any question, you can ask here. You have any suggestion or comment, you can contact me through email. Thank you. I hope I